I don't know how many times he entered my apartment. I've hesitated to share the story for a long, long time because I know how important the mutual trust between a resident and their landlord and maintenance staff is, and I don't want to instill any unnecessary distrust in anyone's landlord. I've shared stories about dangerous and scary residences I've encountered while working at apartment complexes, but this is a story about my time on the other side of things as a renter. Now, before I had even graduated from high school, I knew I wanted to live at Paradise Apartments. I was a bit naive at the time, drawn in by the many amenities I would never use, but I primarily wanted to live there because the complex was pet friendly and within my small budget. When the time eventually came for me to get my own place, I sublet the only apartment they had available and moved inside. Unfortunately, I came to realize the apartment itself was not as nice as I thought it would be. The building was old but remodeled, I guess, so it had all the typical plumbing issues and thin walls. I also learned it was not the safest part of town. I was primarily an online student at this point. I had one class that met in person twice a week at around 8 a.m. in the morning, and I'm a bit of a homebody, so I rarely left during the daytime except for that class, the occasional shopping excursion, or to spend time with my boyfriend in the evening after he got off work. My apartment was a bit of a Bermuda Triangle, even though it only was 600 feet and I lived alone. Things had a way of growing legs and just walking away. I had two kittens at the time and blamed them regularly for things just disappearing. Something odd that kept reoccurring, however, was that I find my underwear box out and sitting in the center of my bedroom floor on days when I had class. I didn't have a proper dresser, instead using an IKEA shelf with some IKEA boxes for designated clothes. Socks, underwears, pants, pajamas. I always could have sworn I put the underwear box away after getting ready for class, but I chalked up to me forgetting as a result of having to get up early and being focused on getting to class on time. Arguably paranoid by the situation, I started to think that some of my laundry was disappearing as well, as favorite articles of clothes would go into the laundry hamper and seemingly never come back with the clean clothes. Towards the end of that semester, I was working one evening on a homework assignment when my boyfriend called to let me know his roommate had accidentally locked him out of their apartment. I had a key to their place, so he asked if I could run over real quick to let him inside. Before I left, I made a mental note that I had left literally every light in my apartment on, because I was living on a pretty tight budget. I normally made a point of turning off all the lights when I left, but my boyfriend only lived about 5 minutes away, so I knew I'd be there and be back very, very quickly. Sure enough, I got back less than 15 minutes later. I immediately sensed something was off, as I could see the lights were off through the blinds. I called my boyfriend and he drove over to meet me. We unlocked the door and went inside. All the lights were off in my apartment. Thinking maybe I had a power outage, I flipped on the main light and it came on. My boyfriend checked the entire apartment. No one was inside, but someone had gone through and systematically turned off every light at their switch, including my lizard's basking light, the only light I always left on because it was on a timer, and my laptop, which I left open on my assignment, but now the computer had been powered down and closed. We called the emergency maintenance number, and I explained that someone had been inside of my apartment, and they had to have used the key because there's no sign of forced entry. The manager called me back and told me I had to be imagining things. Maybe I'd forgotten that I had turned off all the lights before I left. I assured him that I wouldn't have turned off the computer or the lizard light. Someone had been in my apartment. I told him I was extremely worried because obviously this person had a key to get in. Either they worked for the complex or maybe it was a previous tenant or guest. I asked if they changed the locks after the previous tenant moved out, and they assured me that they changed the locks after every move out. The manager suggested maybe it was a friend pranking me. Someone else had given a key. The only other people I had given keys were my boyfriend. His key to my apartment had been locked inside his apartment on the same key ring as his own apartment key, and my mom, she lived 3 hours away. In any case, neither of them would have pranked me in this way. The manager finally agreed to send someone out immediately and check the lock for my peace of mind. I brought up my concern that it was someone on the staff, since they would be the only other people with keys at all. The manager claimed the keys were locked in a special safe that required a personalized code in an office with a security camera inside. They changed my locks, but I had my doubts that it would not do much good. As far as I was aware, there were only 2 maintenance men that worked at the complex. One nice older man that didn't seem at all skilled, and a younger guy with a scruffy beard that gave me a bad feeling. I suspected he had to be the one that came in. When I first moved in, the manager had told me that I was getting a new kitchen counter within the first 3 days. I waited to move in my kitchen stuff, but after a week they hadn't come, and then after a few months I completely forgotten about it. One day, I was sitting in my living room and this scruffy maintenance guy walked inside without knocking or announcing himself, and I hadn't received a notice to expect him at all. He said he was there to replace my countertop. It took him 2 days to install one piece of counter. A few weeks later, I was getting out of the shower and heard a single knock at the door. I just called out, "Just 1 minute," and hurried to get some clothes. Not 2 seconds later, the door started to open and I had to slam it shut to stop him from coming inside. He claimed he hadn't heard me call out, but I had my doubts. I don't remember what made-up excuse he had for coming inside. Another time, I made a note from him that he had come in again, but that he made sure not to let my cats out. He also made a note about my third cat being cute. Except I didn't have a third cat. I did, however, have a picture of my childhood cat in my bedroom on the IKEA shelf where I kept my clothes. At that point, I went to the office to ask them to make a note that in my file, I wanted A, at least 24 hours notice before entry going forward, and B, wanted to be always present in future entry occurrences. Now that I knew without a shadow of a doubt that someone was coming in secretly, it all made sense. I hadn't been long after the surprise maintenance visit stopped that things had started moving around in my apartment. He was also on site all the time, and he would know when I came and went. Who knew how many times he had snuck in, how many small souvenirs he had stolen. He could have been coming in while I was asleep. After the night with the lights, I put my own lock on my door, but still didn't totally trust that apartment. I ended up buying a condo shortly after, subleased the apartment, and moved. In the final days before I left, my mom came into town to help me move my stuff. While she was home alone, I was at class. She caught the scruffy maintenance guy trying to get his key to work in my lock. She demanded to know what he was doing, and he said he was there to paint the front door. I hadn't received a notice, and he didn't have any paint or supplies. She told him he could wait until after I'd moved out. A few years later, I was shot by the owner of Paradise Apartments while working in another complex in town, OK Apartments. Shopping is when the employee from one apartment complex takes a tour at another apartment complex under the guise of wanting an apartment for the purpose of gaining information they might not otherwise easily give up. It can also be performed by your own management company to make sure you're doing a good job. There were certain tells a shopper always liked, like asking specific worded questions, "Is it safe here? I'm a felon, can I live here?" etc., that required specifically worded answers and were easy to trip up on, being too wealthy for the complex, Rolex watches, and being too flexible on what they were interested in. This guy seemed too old and too well off to be randomly considering an apartment at OK. While I was giving the tour, he asked if I had any other options on other apartment complexes in town, and mentioned Paradise specifically. Normally, I wouldn't badmouth any other complexes. I prefer to win them over by showing them the positives of our community, but I told him that I probably wasn't the best person to answer that question because I was probably the only person to give Paradise a bad review in the last 5 years. He asked me to elaborate, and I told him my apartment had been broken into, and I suspected it was someone on their maintenance staff. At that point, he revealed that he was the owner of Paradise, and said he was very disturbed to hear I had this experience. He asked me to describe the maintenance man in detail. I assured him it was in the past, and that I was over it. But he insisted on calling the manager over at Paradise, still the same guy, to ask him over speakerphone if they had any issues with the maintenance staff back in the year I had lived there. His answer was yes. There had been a scruffy young maintenance man he had to fire because he was caught multiple times breaking into the apartments of single women. Satisfied, the owner proudly told me that the issue had been resolved and asked if I would be willing to change my review. I told him no. None of this had changed the fact that I experienced all of this during that time and actually validated what I had suspected. In the years I worked as a leasing agent, I learned a lot about where complexes will cut corners to save time and money. From my experience, a lot of complexes did not switch out the locks if the tenant was good, and a lot did not require background checks for employees, even though they did require them for tenants. Keys got passed out willy-nilly to vendors and maintenance during turns, and employees frequently got master keys that would open all the doors. Now, I won't go as far to say every complex operates this way, but every complex I worked at was doing this when I started there. Because of my experiences, once I began managing a complex, I enforced strict rules about changing locks, tracking keys, posting proper notices, and requiring background checks for all employees and all tenants. At least here in Florida, with MIA's law going into effect this year, background checks for employees and security measures for keys are required for all complexes. Even still, if you're renting an apartment, stay diligent. If you have reason to believe someone is coming into your home, document it and let the staff, police, family, friends know. You never know who might have a key to your apartment.